The Secret History of Primitive Accumulation and Classical Political Economy. Michael Perelman. From the Invention of Capitalism. Durham and London, Duke University Press, 2000. The Laissez-faire Message of Classical Political Economy. Classical Political Economy, the core works of economic literature from the time of William Petty through that of David Ricardo, presents an imposing facade. These towering figures of early political economy forged a new way of thinking systematically about economic affairs with little more than the writings of business people and moral philosophers to guide them. For more than 2 centuries, successive generations of economists have been grinding out texts to demonstrate how these early economists discovered that markets provide the most efficient method possible for organizing production. This conclusion is ostensibly the intended lesson of classical political economy. Most contemporary readers of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and the other classical political economists accept their work at face value, assuming these early writers to be uncompromising advocates of laissez-faire. For the most part, even many Marxists accept this interpretation of classical political economy. Alongside their work on pure economic theory, the classical political economists engaged on a parallel project, to promote the forcible reconstruction of society to remake it into their purely market-oriented society. While economist historians may debate how deeply most people were involved in market activities, the incontestable fact remains that most people in Britain did not enthusiastically engage in wage labor, at least so long as they had an alternative. The classical political economists actively advocated measures to deprive people of any alternative to wage labor. The brutal acts associated with the process of stripping the majority of the people of the means of producing for themselves might seem far removed from the laissez-faire reputation of classical political economy. In reality, the dispossession of the majority of the people and the construction of laissez-faire are closely connected, so much so that Marx, or at least his translators, called this expropriation of the masses, primitive accumulation. The very sound of the expression, primitive accumulation, drips with poignant echoes of human consequences. The term, primitive, has a number of connotations. It suggests a brutality lacking the subtleties of the more modern forms of exploitation with which we are familiar. It implies that primitive accumulation was prior to the form of accumulation that people generally associate with capitalism. Finally implies something that we might associate with the primitive parts of the world, where capital accumulation has not advanced as far as elsewhere. Keep in mind that the second term in the expression, primitive accumulation, reminds us that the primary focus of the process is the accumulation of capital and wealth by a small sector of society. In this regard, recall Marx's description of accumulation as the conquest of the world of social wealth. It is the extension of the area of exploited human material and, at the same time, the extension of the indirect and direct sway of the capitalist. Marx 1977, pages 739–40. Certainly, at least in the early stages of capitalism, primitive accumulation was a central element in the accumulation process. Although many modern scholars acknowledge the pervasive nature of primitive accumulation during the time that the classical political economists wrote, nobody to my knowledge has recognized that the classical political economists strongly advocated policies that furthered the process of primitive accumulation. In addition, I argue that the classical political economists engaged in a serious subterfuge. While energetically promoting their laissez-faire ideology, time and time again, they advocated policies that flew in the face of their laissez-faire principles, especially in their analysis of the role of small-scale, rural producers. The Secret History of Primitive Accumulation. perhaps because so much of what the classical economists wrote about traditional systems of agricultural production was divorced from their seemingly more timeless remarks about pure theory. Later readers have passed over such portions of their works in haste. Although this aspect of classical political economy might have seemed to fall outside the core of the subject, I argue that these interventionist recommendations were a significant element in the overall thrust of their works. Specifically, classical political economy advocated restricting the viability of traditional occupations in the countryside to coerce people to work for wages. The vitality of these rural producers generally rested upon a careful combination of industrial and agricultural pursuits. Despite the efficiency of this arrangement, classical political economy was intent on throttling small producers. Classical political economists often justified their position in terms of the efficiency of the division of labor. They called for measures that would actively promote the separation of agriculture and industry. Marx's concept of the social division of labor is very important in this respect. In contrast to Smith's exclusive emphasis on the division of labor, the arrangement of work within the firm, Marx suggested that we also pay attention to the deployment of resources between individual firms and households, the social division of labor. Classical political economists paid virtually no attention to the social division of labor in their theoretical works. For example, Adam Smith offered a detailed description of the division of labor in his famous pin factory, but he did not bother to extend his discussion to the next question: what does it mean that society is partitioned in such a way that the pin industry purchases its metals or fuels instead of producing them itself? How does such an arrangement originate? Could such changes in the pattern of industries make a difference in an economy, even if technology were unchanging? These questions seem to be so far removed from the purview of classical political economy that more than 2 centuries later Ronald Coase won a Nobel Prize for bringing them to the attention of mainstream economists. Following in the wake of Coase, a group of modern economists developed the new institutionalist school of economics. See Perelman 1991. According to the new institutionalists, economic forces naturally arrange themselves into some optimal pattern. Like many other economists, the new institutional school takes pride in locating anticipations of its work in classical political economy, especially in the works of Adam Smith. Even though the new institutionalist school concerns itself with the social division of labor, its theories are of no use in analyzing primitive accumulation. I suspected that the continuing silence about the social division of labor might have something important to reveal. Following this line of investigation, I looked at what classical political economy had to say about the peasantry and self-sufficient agriculturalists. Here again, the pattern was consistent. The classical political economists were unwilling to trust market forces to determine the social division of labor because they found the tenacity of traditional rural producers to be distasteful. Rather than contending that market forces should determine the fate of these small-scale producers, classical political economy called for state interventions of one sort or another to hobble these people's ability to produce for their own needs. Their policy recommendations amounted to a blatant manipulation of the social division of labor. We cannot justify such policies in terms of efficiency. If efficiency were of great importance to them, the classical political economists would not have ignored the law permitting the gentry to ride across small farmers' fields in pursuit of foxes, while forbidding the farmers from